Welcome, everyone. I am Ari Ingel, the Director of Creative Community for Peace. It's a pleasure to have everyone joining us again today. Creative Community for Peace is a nonprofit entertainment industry organization comprised of prominent members of the entertainment community who have come together to promote the arts as a bridge to peace, to counter anti-Semitism within the entertainment industry, and to galvanize against the cultural boycott of Israel. To learn more about our work and to support our work, please visit ccfpeace.com. That is ccfpeace.com or creativecommunityforpeace.com. We are once again glad to have all of you with us today in our public square and joining us for this installment of our Dispelling the Myth series, which is an educational series of conversations with some of the leading experts on the issues and challenges facing Israel and the Jewish people today. Today, we're going to be discussing Israel's place at the United Nations and how Israel has become the Jew amongst the nations. Please feel free to leave questions in the Q&A section of the chat, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible towards the end of the discussion. We just ask everyone that you please post questions in the Q&A section only. All other comments or ideas can be emailed to us at info@creativecommunityforpeace.com. That's info@creativecommunityforpeace.com. We always love hearing from everybody and your remarks and your comments. In conversation with me today is Hillel Neuer, who is an international lawyer, diplomat, writer, and activist, who is currently the executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO based in Geneva, Switzerland. In this role, he has often testified in defense of Israel and the Jewish people at the United Nations and in front of the United States Congress. Prior to joining UN Watch, Hillel practiced commercial and civil rights litigation, where he represented people such as Oprah Winfrey and other high-profile individuals and corporations. Since 2009, Hillel has headed a coalition of 25 human rights groups as chair of the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy, a renowned international gathering that provides a global platform to courageous pro-democracy dissidents from around the world who put their lives on the line to demand fundamental freedoms from oppressive regimes. McGill University has awarded Hillel with the honorary doctorate for his work to advance human rights and for being, as they said, a voice for those without one. His 2017 speech, "Where Are Your Jews?" before the United Nations Human Rights Council has been replicated in multiple languages across social media and seen by millions of people. You should certainly Google and check that out if you haven't seen it already. It is really, really compelling. We are honored to have Hillel with us today. Welcome, Hillel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Just to get right into it, so time is short and I know a lot of people have questions. The UN is sort of a nebulous and mythical entity for many. They see it as like this world's parliament. For people that don't know, just at a basic level, can you briefly outline the United Nations for us, its structure and how it was set up?
Sure, it's a lot.
I'm giving us the brief version, essentially.
I'll do my best. I only get 90 seconds to speak at the UN, and I do a lot of tweets, so I try to only speak in 90-second bits. The UN was created in 1945. It has a combination of idealism and realism. The idealism is expressed in the UN Charter, which was envisioned by intellectuals or a brain trust surrounding FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the UN Charter itself is an expression of liberal internationalism. It speaks about fundamental freedoms for all, human dignity, international peace and security. So we like the United Nations Charter. We like the idea of the UN. That's the idealism. The realism is that, you know, the idea was that you'd get the great powers around the table who could prevent war. As Churchill said, better jaw than war. So Stalin was there from the beginning, right? The 5 permanent members of the Security Council include Russia and China, along with France, the US, and the UK. So it is a combination of the idealism and the realism. It wanted the great powers there. And the result, you know, some 7 decades later is mixed. The UN is a forum. And when great powers have the will to do the right thing and, you know, stop a war, the UN can be the venue for it. But when great powers don't have that will, the UN is typically weak. And the UN, sometimes the UN is a forum of nations. So there's the Security Council, 15 countries, 5 of whom have the veto. As I mentioned them before, the US, China, France, the UK, and Russia. There is the General Assembly, which is the World Parliament. That's 193 countries, There's no veto, so majority rules, and often it's a majority of dictatorship, so it's not real democracy because they don't really represent their people, they represent the regimes. And then other bodies like the Human Rights Council here in Geneva is a microcosm of the General Assembly. It's 47 countries, but also one country, one vote. And they're ironically, paradoxically, though it's supposed to protect human rights, many of the world's worst regimes seek to join the council to prevent themselves and their allies from ever being condemned. So it's kind of a mix, and the UN can work if enough countries try to do the right thing, but often that does not happen.
Right. And we'll get into a lot of that today. Just briefly, who funds the UN and how is it funded?
You do. And most people on this call who are from the United States do. The UN
overwhelmingly, right? I think
the UN has a system where they assess countries. The US assessment is approximately 22%, and that's by far the largest amount. Other countries are paying 5%, 7%, 10%. You know, it's the wealthy countries, and it's not always very fair. Of course, with payment, you get some influence. So one hopes that the US has some clout, though it's not always the case.
Right.
So the taxpayers pay, and there's an assessed contribution that goes into the general budget, and then there's voluntary sums. The United States and other countries voluntarily give additional money beyond that 22% to the UN Refugee Agency, to the Human Rights Office, and other bodies. So the United States in a given year might give, I'm not sure what the number is, but it's several billions of dollars to the UN.
Right. So getting more focused on Israel, how on earth did the Jews in 1947 convince the world to establish a state of Israel? And is there anything interesting around that vote that maybe you can share with us?
It's a good question. Look, the UN, and just to sharpen the question, you know, how is it that a United Nations, which can be relied upon now for at least 5 decades to condemn Israel in the words of Abba Iban, if Algeria introduced a resolution saying that the earth was flat and Israel was to blame, the vote would be 140 in favor, 9 opposed, and 12 abstained. And that's true. So how is it that a body like the General Assembly, which has such a strong automatic majority against Israel, did find the numbers to endorse a Jewish state on 29 November 1947? And the answer in a nutshell is the UN membership was quite different. Then it was about 50 countries, and many of them were Western type of countries, Western Europe, Latin America, and so forth. The countries of Africa and Asia had not yet been decolonized. So that was one element to it. The other piece is that Israel had not been created, and we spoke in the title, Israel is the Jew among the nations, which is a quote that comes from the historian Talmon, and it's been used by various people, including my teacher, Professor Irwin Cotler, the former Justice Minister of Canada. That concept of Israel as the Jew among the nations took some time to develop in the world consciousness. In 1947, Israel was still something new. It didn't exist yet. And of course, there was the Holocaust. So it was 2 years after the Holocaust, there was guilt on the part of many countries. And there was a terrific lobbying campaign by the Zionist movement and its friends and supporters from the Philippines to Latin America and all around the world. And they did manage to get a majority at that time. And unfortunately today, it's hard for Israel to get a majority. The anti-Israel automatic majority has very much cemented itself. Right.
And I guess in 1947, I guess the early founders of Israel, the early Zionists, were very communist and socialist, or had those tendencies. So I guess the Soviet Union perhaps wasn't fully against them at that time. And so I guess that brings me to my next question.
But I'm going to cut you off because I wanted to say, and I forgot to, is you did have a unique moment.
Right.
Just what you said was that, from then on, when the Cold War was already kicking in then, the Soviet Union was against Israel, and with it, you had enormous amount of communist countries. Well, all the communist countries voted with the Soviet Union, as did many so-called later non-aligned countries, which were influenced by the Soviet Union. You did have a unique moment. I don't think it was because of the socialistic aspect of Israel. They didn't like, Stalin didn't really care that much about the kibbutzim. What they did want is to kick the British out. So you had a unique moment.
Got it.
And for the religiously inclined, it's a divine moment. Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, if I'm not mistaken, in his essay on Kol Dodi Dofek, talks about how there was a divine moment where in the height of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union actually agreed. And in the words of Gromyko, the foreign minister, he actually made the case for Israel, which, a year later or 2 years later, already by the time Golda Meir came to Moscow, they and Jews came out to see her in the synagogue of Moscow. They shut that down, and Soviet Union became very anti-Zionist. So it was kind of a unique moment, and certainly the majority, due to the communist countries being on board in the Soviet Union, that dissipated very quickly.
Right. I guess in 1947, one area where British soldiers were still being killed was in then Mandate Palestine, and by some of the Jewish forces. So I guess it made sense for them to think that perhaps there was a chance that they could align with this new country. So when did this occur? When did, as you say, Jacob Talman said, the Jew among the nations, when did this start occurring? I guess very shortly afterwards. And, why did it occur? Is just Israel aligned itself with the West, and all of a sudden it became the ire of, all these other countries?
Why did what occur?
Why did Israel become such a vilified nation at the United Nations?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think there's different pieces to it, and we can trace it till today. Then I'd say you have a combination of realpolitik, which everyone can understand. Those are geopolitical interests. And then you have things that are not rational, that are supra-rational, and that might deal more in the area of psychology, because what governments do is what people want them to do, and people are governed by psychology. So the geopolitical aspects are the following. The Arab states, declared war on Israel from the beginning,
right.
And they wanted to destroy Israel, and they said so, and they took action to do so. They were supported by the Islamic State. So you quite quickly had an Arab-Islamic alliance against Israel built in from the very beginning. The Arab countries had declared jihad against Israel, and you had people like the Mufti, who was allied with Hitler and who was inciting Muslims during World War II using Nazi rhetoric, and that kicked in. So you had in the Arab Muslim world this enmity against Israel. You then had the Soviet Union, because, as you indicated, Israel did ally itself with the West, and indeed it wasn't sure immediately how that would go. And there were some hardline kibbutzim that still had pictures of Stalin even after he died, hanging in the kibbutz. But Ben Gurion was never a communist. He was never a Stalinist. He was a Zionist, and the communists were fiercely anti-Zionist, and they always were, starting from the 1920s. So that was clear. So you had the Arab world against Israel, you had the Islamic world against Israel, you had the communist regimes against Israel, and then you had, the non-aligned movement, the new countries in Africa and Asia that I'd say were influenced by different things. They were influenced by the Soviet Union. They were also influenced by the hard left. And I'll just, this could be a long discussion, but I'll just mention one element is that, I was just at a debate a few days ago here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, where a UN expert said that Israel is apartheid. Right. And we're hearing that by certain human rights groups that belong to the far left. What in England was Jeremy Corbyn type people, people like the mayor of London, Red Ken, who said Hitler was a Zionist. These are the same people. Ken Livingstone, who said Hitler was a Zionist, is a friend of Jeremy Corbyn, and his wife, Ken Livingstone's wife, for 20 years was Kate Allen, who was the head of Amnesty International in London. Wow. That's the organization that just said Israel's apartheid as well. So these are the same sociologically, the same people, ideologically the same people as a hard left, and they were influenced by certain ideas. Some of it was the Soviet Union had an incitement disinformation campaign of Zionism as racism going back to the 1950s, which ultimately influenced the UN. It influenced the world. You had someone named Professor Toynbee, Arnold Toynbee, who as early as the 1950s was saying that Israel had committed war crimes in 1948 and that Israel acted like the Nazis. There's a famous debate with Ambassador Yaakov Herzog, who was the uncle of the current president, Yitzhak Herzog, His father was Chaim Herzog, the president of Israel. His uncle was Yaakov Herzog, who was Israeli ambassador to Canada. And he famously had a debate with Toynbee in my hometown, Montreal, McGill University in 1961. And he debated Toynbee on two things. Toynbee was the great historian at the time in the world. And he had said, number one, the Jews were a fossil people, that they had not been alive for 2,000 years.
Right.
They were a fossil. And Herzog confronted him on that and talked about the Jewish contributions to culture throughout history, including
throughout the world.
The Mishnah and the Talmud and Maimonides and many other things during the time that he said that Jews were a fossil. But the other thing that Herzog debated Toynbee, was his statement that the Israelis were like the Nazis. So this isn't Amnesty International of 2022 or the 1980s. This is 1950s. Already you had certain people who were not positively inclined towards the Jews, who had this inversion. So I would say, in addition to the geopolitical aspects, you have a hostility to Jews, which is part of Western civilization going back 1,000, 2,000 years. And it began to express itself. The Holocaust made the conventional anti-Semitism of the time impolite. In the 1930s, you could say, I don't like Jews, they're pushy, they're this or that. You could say that in polite company. You could have quotas against Jews. You had it in America. We had it in Canada, where I grew up. And anti-Semitism was acceptable in polite company. After the Holocaust, it wasn't very acceptable. It still existed, but it wasn't very acceptable. But suddenly it mutated. And it was acceptable to say, the Jews are acting like Nazis. Whatever the Nazis did, the Nazis are occupiers, the Jewish state is. The Nazis are racist, the Jewish state is. The Nazis committed genocide, the Jewish state is. So whatever you wanted to say, you could attach it to Israel. So in addition to the geopolitical aspects, you had this new anti-Semitism, which mutated into demonizing Israel.
Right. I guess it's like Dara Horn says, people love dead Jews, that they didn't mind remembering the Holocaust, but the actual living Jews, they were still hostile towards. So just to talk about some of the more infamous anti-Israel moments of the UN, and then there's just a couple I want to go through. The first being Yasser Arafat's speech at the UN in 1974, that some had dubbed, for some reason, the olive branch speech, which was anything but. And this is when the PLO was granted permanent observer status. Can you just discuss a little bit about that speech and what it was really about and why the PLO was granted this special status?
Yeah, well,
I'm really testing you today.
No, that's fine. There's just a lot to unpack there. We have to talk about the PLO, which is that, you mentioned 29 November 1947, which is when the United Nations General Assembly voted for a Jewish state and an Arab state in the former Palestine Mandate. The Jews celebrated and danced and endorsed it, and the Arabs declared war. During that time, the territories that were supposed to go to the Arab state were occupied by Jordan, Judea and Samaria, which later became known as the West Bank. In the 1947 resolution, they're described as Judea and Samaria in the United Nations document. That's been forgotten. The Jordan occupied those territories, and the PLO, as it began to be created by the Arab states in the early 1960s, was about liberating not those territories occupied by Jordan, but confronting Israel. After the 6-Day War, suddenly there became this new attention to Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, and suddenly that became, and Gaza, which was occupied by Egypt. Suddenly these were now under Israeli control, and suddenly this became the narrative, which is that Israel is the occupier of these territories, which Jordan and Egypt had occupied before, and no one had cared much about it. So the PLO suddenly was given new force, and certainly elevated the import of that moment. Arafat says, I'm bringing the olive branch, but I also have the gun. He had a holster with him. They wanted to bring a gun. He didn't bring the gun. They wouldn't let him, but he had the holster. And he said, if I want to do peace, but if you don't, then I'm going to, use the gun. This is at a time when his organization was inventing modern terrorism as we know it, including plane hijackings one after the other, the massacre in Munich. These were organizations part or affiliated with Yasser Arafat. So he was legitimized by the UN in 1974, around the time that in Europe, he was being legitimized as well, including by an infamous Jewish head of state, It was the Chancellor of Austria, Bruno Kreisky. He embraced Arafat, and he was Jewish, kind of a self-hating Jew, and he made embracing Arafat an acceptable thing to do in Europe at that time.
Wow. And then obviously a year later in 1975, so a year after Arafat's, olive branch speech, we had Resolution 3379, where they determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. So apparently that was the olive branch Arafat was referring to. Can you discuss just a little bit about that vote and how it came about?
Yes, that is an infamous day at the UN. It came about through many factors. One, as I mentioned, was the Soviet Union had embarked upon a massive campaign to describe Zionism as racism, and they would use classical anti-Semitic motifs. There were hundreds of books, thousands of articles, there were daily cartoons. These were pumped out in 80 different languages around the world, and they influenced many people, including particularly the left, that was sympathetic to socialism and communism at that time, before everyone knew what Stalin was up to. And so they did poison a lot of left-wing discourse around the world. So that's one element. They were also poisoning the discourse in the third world, as it was then called, in Africa and Asia. And the Soviet Union is considered to be very much a part of that resolution, very much behind it, together with the Arab states. The Arab states had failed to defeat Israel on the battlefield in 1948, 56, 73, sorry, 67, 73. But suddenly, by the late 60s, they realized the United Nations was a very friendly battlefield for them, not a military battlefield, a diplomatic battlefield. They discovered they had an automatic majority with the Soviet Union and the communist states, the Arab states, and with the so-called non-aligned countries from Africa and Asia. And so they began to bring one resolution after another. And it began they started at first at a women's conference in Mexico City, Zionism is racism, and then people didn't really understand what was going on. And then it came to New York. The United States Ambassador Patrick Moynihan made a valiant stand, gave one of the greatest speeches in the history of the United Nations. If someone's interested, you could find it on YouTube or on our website, unwatch.org. Chaim Herzog, the Israeli ambassador, who's the father of the current president of Israel, also gave a historic speech, also worth reading. And the General Assembly passed it by a majority. And I'll just say this, which is that in 1975, when that resolution was adopted, Patrick Moynihan said, the United States rises to declare that it does not acknowledge, and it will never acquiesce to this infamous act. Right. I'm paraphrasing. And in most influential areas of society, that was considered a terrible act, and it was considered an anti-Semitic act. And it sort of stayed in the UN. And sadly, today, those same ideas have revived themselves and have permeated through many other sectors that would once have rejected those ideas.
Right. And just to go back to my previous question, the PLO, so they were granted this special status. Like, what does that grant them? And there are other countries, or not countries, obviously, there are other entities that have this special status? Or is this really like, given the Palestinians, because they're anti-Israel, something that other entities, I don't know if it was the Kurds or other disenfranchised or like groups and ethnicities didn't have?
I'm not aware of any other national entity that or national organization that received observer status at the UN. There was the Vatican, which had it. So there was the Vatican and the PLO. Switzerland was an observer until about 20 years ago when they became a member. But if you're referring to the Kurds and the Uyghurs and the Basques and all that, none of them have that. So you just had this massive automatic majority, and just a handful of countries opposed, and so they just were able to ram it through, and no one had any interest in promoting any other national minority or what have you. So the PLO,
they were unfortunate for them, they weren't battling the Jewish state for the Kurds
That
or
is
for the
correct. Yeah. So
Uyghurs or other
the
minorities.
The PLO had observer status, and then around 2012, the United Nations voted to recognize them as a state. They're a non-member state, meaning they don't get to vote. They're not one of the 100, but they are called a state, and that had consequences for the International Criminal Court, which said since they're a state, the UN says they're a state, then they can have jurisdiction and they can sort of sue Israel. So it's kind of you kind of have a very comfortable situation for the Palestinians where when they want to prosecute Israel, they're a state. But if you ever want to hold them accountable for anything, you know, why don't they vaccinate their own people? It's like, no, we have nothing. We're just occupied. We're nobody. We're powerless. But if they want jurisdiction to go after Israel, then, you know, they're a state, and it's called the State of Palestine. So on one day or another, and certain advocacy groups will emphasize how significant their powers are, and then other times they'll claim that they have such weak powers.
All the benefits with none of the burdens. I guess that's really the way it is. So the next really infamous event against Israel, the anti-Israel movement, was in 2001. The United Nations organized the Durban Conference that was supposed to be an anti-racist forum, which then devolved into a forum of hate against Israel, causing Israel and America to walk out. And this was also really the first time that Israel was labeled an apartheid state in any sort of formal setting. Can you briefly discuss this conference, and, you know, how was this even allowed to happen? How was a conference that was supposed to be anti-racist from an organization America, you know, heavily funds, allowed to take place?
Well, you're really walking us through the Hall of Horrors here.
Well,
I'll just tell the audience, we didn't coordinate. I had no idea what he was going to ask me. He said, just asking questions, and it's fine. You're asking about very important things. That's why I take a moment to think. Then I speak quickly, but I take a moment to think. So you're really going through a lot of the horrors, and it's fine. It's getting very depressing. We're going to have
Unfortunately, I have some more horrors ahead.
I don't doubt it.
And well, maybe a happy moment or two.
I will try. Maybe someone will ask at the end of this to give some of the more optimistic angle to things. But 2001 was indeed a terrible moment. And it was indeed where we felt that Zionism as racism was revived in some form, because Zionism as racism, to give the positive part, was repealed. In 1991, in December, just as the Soviet Union was dissolving, and that wasn't accidental, the UN, actually, General Assembly, rescinded the Zionism as racism resolution, which was great. Sadly, it still lives on, and the most famous example you gave is 2001. There was a World Conference Against Racism. This was in post-apartheid South Africa. It was supposed to be a wonderful event. And two things happened. One was there was the Conference of Governments, and then there was a parallel event, was the non-governmental organizations had a sort of side parallel conference. So in the governmental conference, which was the main one, the terrible thing that happened there was the declaration they adopted, which is hundreds of pages, included a short part, but nevertheless a part, when it listed victims of racism, the only group listed were the Palestinians. So by implication, Israel was the only country called out for being effectively committing the act of racism. Those weren't the words, but the Palestinians were listed as the only victims of racism. That was in the governmental declaration, and that's why we object to that declaration to this day. But the second more pernicious part was the non-governmental organizations called Israel an apartheid state and accused it of genocide, and sort of they threw the entire kitchen sink at it. And maybe some of us were naive. I guess Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor was not, because he said that's the NGO declaration is their strategy. And indeed, you know, I'm sure you're fast forwarding to that, but you know, today that's what major NGOs, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, who in Durban said, well, we didn't really go along with it. Why didn't you condemn it? Well, we tried to, but we didn't really. They kind of distanced themselves at the times from that. And today they're adopting the same rhetoric. So that's what happened in the non-governmental declaration, where Israel was declared these terrible things. And then on the streets of South Africa, there were thousands of people who marched, primarily Muslims, who were organized by, it was the time of the Second Intifada. So they were organized in these huge marches where they said Zionism is racism, Hitler was correct, Hitler was right. And so those things happened on the streets of Durban and at the non-governmental forum.
And so that, I guess, brings us to this final thing I just want to discuss of sort of like infamous anti-Israel moments, which is the United Nations Special Rapporteurs on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories. So there's been John Dugard, Richard Falk, we just had Michael Link, and all three have been extremely anti-Israel. All have called Israel an apartheid state, and essentially releasing the same report at the end of their terms. What are they supposed to be doing, and who assigns them? And I guess, who's the new one? And is it just going to be more of the same?
Yes, so there is a position at the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is a body of 47 governments, and they appoint experts, monitors, to cover either countries or themes. And among the themes, there are about 40 or so experts who cover women's rights, torture, freedom of speech, etc. And then you have about a dozen that cover countries, meaning only about a dozen countries are monitored. There's a monitor on North Korea, on Sudan, on Somalia, and on the Palestinian territories. All right, you and I could argue on whether there of only 12 places in the world, Palestinian territories should be a place to be monitored. But if there's a monitor there, then fine, let the monitor speak out for violations that Israel may do, Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. Let the special rapporteur on human rights in the Palestinian territories speak out for human rights. Right. The reality, though, is that the mandate doesn't say that. That's the title. The mandate from February 1993, meaning before the Oslo process, before Hamas took over Gaza, before the PA controlled Bethlehem and Ramallah and et cetera, they weren't there. They didn't have any ruling authority. But the mandate is to look only at Israel, and it's called to investigate, quote, Israel's violations. So the mandate of the special rapporteur is to investigate Israel's violations. So anyone who applies for the job is kind of saying, well, we like biased mandates to condemn only Israel.
Right. So there's nothing to say investigate Hamas, investigate the Palestinian Authority, nothing about, not the whole situation, just one side of the situation.
No, the title purports to be fair. Special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Palestinian territories. That's the title. But the reality of what the mandate is and what the person does is only to go after Israel. And if the mandate holder, you mentioned several of them, if they wanted to, they could say, well, I was given the mandate to do this, but the only way I can speak about what Israel did is if I also give the context. And the context is that Hamas fired 4,000 rockets at Israeli cities in May. The context is that in the past 7 days in Israel, there have been 3 terrorist attacks by people affiliated with ISIS, killed 11 Jews, Arabs, and Ukrainians. This is the context, and I have to mention it as well. And various UN mandate holders over the years in other positions found ways, even if given a restricted mandate, to bring in the context and to even things out. But what happens is that you asked the question quite correctly, who chooses this person? So I don't want to get into too much inside baseball, but there's a committee of 5 governments that is a vetting committee, and they recommend someone, and then the chair of the council chooses. The chair of the Human Rights Council chooses, but with the consent of all the countries. So the majority ends up deciding. So I'll give you an interesting story. About, I want to say maybe 8 years ago, maybe it's 2014, the vetting committee exceptionally was made up of some good countries. Canada was head of the vetting committee. It's called the consultative group. And the Canadian ambassador said, for the Palestine mandate, it's once every 6 years, we think we should pick someone who actually has no record of bias, something radical, and actually is someone who could build bridges with both sides, be a positive force for peace in the region, and has no prior record on these issues. We therefore nominate Christina Cerna, a human rights advocate in Washington, D.C., who worked for the Organization of American States. We looked at her CV, couldn't find anything about Israel, not against, not for Palestine, nothing. She was dealing with Latin America, other issues. She was an international human rights expert, could have done a perfectly good job. She was recommended, given the #1 priority. The Arab states went nuts. They wrote a letter to the president of the Human Rights Council that said, don't you dare choose this #1 ranked person. She has no experience. She has no expertise. When they say expertise, they mean someone who follows our line. So she got nixed, even though she was the #1 ranked by the vetting committee. The chairman came under the pressure of the Arab Islamic states and all the majorities that they wield. And he ended up picking someone who was an easy choice, the former Indonesian ambassador. He ended up resigning. Then they put Michael Link. And since then, the vetting committees are not even as good. They don't even put up a fight. Michael Link is viciously anti-Israel. He was an anti-Israel advocate his whole life. He had the job for 6 years. Of course, he condemned Israel's apartheid because 10 years ago in Canada, when he was a professor there, he was part of Israel Apartheid Week. That's why the Palestinians picked him.
Right.
On Friday, they're going to pick a replacement. And the number one choice is an Italian lawyer named Francesca Albanese. She used to work for UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinians. And she routinely compares Israel to the Nazis using the Holocaust inversion. She accuses Israel of apartheid, genocide, and all the rest. And
so
that's why they
in 6
want
years,
her.
we're going to get the same report that Michael Link just released this last week, that Israel is a genocidal apartheid state and nothing more. So that actually brings me, you always are great at tweeting out, you know, taking on the Human Rights Council for a moment, like all the members of it. And the members are Eritrea, Libya, Sudan, China, Pakistan, Qatar, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, you know, the great human rights champions of the world. Like, what was the Human Rights Council set up to do? And what does it actually do? Does it do anything?
The Human Rights Council is, as I said, it's 47 countries. They meet 3 times a year for 1-month sessions. They adopt resolutions. The council is only as good as its members. You listed many of their dominant members. The dictatorships comprise today 68.1% are either dictatorships or other non-democracies. You have 32% that are democracies. The United States just joined, the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and others. So there are democracies there, but currently they're in the minority. And sometimes they're able to put forward a resolution on North Korea or Myanmar, which does something good by spotlighting abuses in a terrible country. But too often they turn a blind eye to the world's worst abusers because they're sitting on the council or their allies are sitting on the council. So the vast majority of the worst abusers never get condemned. And often they pass resolutions that are kind of disinformation, things that people are not sensitive to. Maybe now they are. People were asking me, why is it that some Western countries vote against a resolution condemning Nazism? How could the United States or maybe even Israel abstain? And what is going on there? Well, now you know Putin, for at least 20 years, has had a propaganda campaign, the KGB, to describe all of Russia's rivals or countries that they want to conquer as Nazi countries. That's their thing. And so that what we all know now, that they're attacking Ukraine to denazify Ukraine. Right. Putin has been saying that about all of its allies, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, etc., which fits into their World War II rhetoric, which was not all a lie. The Soviet Union fought the Nazis. The Nazis did have supporters in many of these countries. But anyway, the annual resolution that's adopted in New York on Nazism is put forward by Putin, and it's not against real Nazism, it's against his enemies. Right. So I just give that as an example of many resolutions that are Orwellian, that are twisted. There's a resolution on the right to peace that's brought by Syria. Okay, there are many human rights resolutions brought by China, Cuba, Pakistan, introduced many resolutions. So what does the Human Rights Council do? Some good things, many bad things, a lot of demonizing of Israel. Right. So, you know, UN is, this council has condemned Israel something like 90 times since it was formed. And I think the next closest is North Korea with something around like 12 or 13 times. And there's this standing agenda 7 item. Can you just explain what that is? Because I know a lot of people always hear about this standing agenda 7 item, but don't really know what that represents. Sure. Here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, the council meets a month, 3 times a year for a month in September, March, and June. They're meeting now and about to end on Friday, a month-long session. And throughout that session, they follow the same agenda. There's 10 agenda items. Item 1 is like organization of the session. Item 2 is report of the High Commissioner. Item 3, civil and political rights. Item 4, human rights situations around the world. Item 6, universal periodic review. Item 7, human rights violations in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. So you have one agenda item 4, human rights situations around the world. If you want to talk about 193 countries, what they're doing, you could do that during the day that they debate item 4. And then there's a day where they debate item 7, which is Israeli violations. So one day for the whole world and one day for Israel alone. No other country in the world, not even Iran, North Korea, Syria, Russia, has its own agenda item, only Israel.
Right. Right. And, I guess the General Assembly, this happens there too. Every year, in addition to the Human Rights Council, we always get, 13, 14 resolutions condemning Israel and maybe one condemning Iran or Syria. Like, what are the substance of these General Assembly resolutions? Are there any standing ones, or is it every year they just come up with a couple, 15 new ones to condemn Israel?
That's a great question. I'm going to ask you to hold that thought because I've been speaking so much, I run out of water.
Okay.
So please play elevator music for our people in California, and I'll be right back in a second with some water.
Right. Oh, you're back. I was going to maybe see if I could...
I was afraid that when I came back, you were going to say, everybody hide.
No, I was going to actually maybe play. I was going to get your clip where you... where are your
water, I didn't give you the time. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. So
you're asking about the GA, where there's one resolution on Iran, one on Syria, one on North Korea.
Like what? And every year,
14 or 15 on Israel.
Right. Every year, what are those resolutions every year? And are they the same resolutions, or is every year someone comes up with 15 resolutions just for Israel?
They're typically the same.
Yeah.
They're annual resolutions. There's a custom at the UN to adopt annual resolutions on various subjects. So there'll be resolutions that do the following: condemn Israel for being on the Golan Heights and calling for it to give it back to Syria, even though Syria used the heights to attack Israel and is currently a genocidal regime. That if they had the heights, they would probably be killing the people living there, whether they were Arabs or Jews. And that's why Israel's not planning to give it to Syria anytime soon. But there's 2 resolutions calling on Israel to give the Golan to Syria. There are several resolutions about UNRWA, the UN agency dedicated only to Palestinian so-called refugees. There's about 3 resolutions on them. There are resolutions condemning Israel for human rights violations. There are resolutions calling for Palestinian self-determination, even though, as you already indicated, Palestinians are the only ones who have a special status at the UN of being recognized as a state, where you should have a resolution on self-determination of the Kurds and the Basques and all kinds of others. There is none. It's only the Palestinians. There's resolutions saying that the UN needs to promote the Palestine Information Program, which is sort of pro-PLO propaganda. There's a resolution creating the Committee on Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which is a committee that condemns Israel. So those are some of the resolutions.
So every year, the Tibetans don't get anything, the Uyghurs don't get anything, the Kurds, it's just one after the other Israel.
Zero.
Right. So with the signing of the Abraham Accords and warming...
And I just want to say something. So I want to say something. People should understand it's not a small thing. I mean, you just said, for example, the Uyghurs get 0. Right. If there were to be one resolution on a country, whether it's on China or whether it's on Pakistan, it's a big deal. Okay.
Right.
Countries do enormous campaigning and diplomatic démarches, and to get a resolution passed is a very big deal. And each resolution takes up a lot of time in foreign ministries to review them and decide how they're doing. The fact that you have more than one on Israel is weird. It's almost nuts. The fact that you have 15 is bonkers. If someone said, I'm going to do 15 resolutions on Russia, the Americans would say, what are you driving us crazy with 15? Put it in one text. Put it in 2 if you must. But no one would countenance having 15. But on Israel, people just go along.
So it's like the anti-Semitism has been desensitized. It's like so commonplace that Israel is called out and is just... I know you don't like me saying it, but I think Yossi Klein Halevi said it was like the Jewish state has become the Jew of the state. I mean, it's just singled out as like the Jew, essentially, at the UN. But with the Abraham Accords, that's what I was going to talk about, and the warming relations with countries in Eastern Europe, and even like Brazil and India. Is there any end in sight to this and Israel being condemned? Do we have, this is the hopeful, is there reason that we can maybe be hopeful that this will change? But, for instance, just past December, there was a resolution, I think it was like 129-11, that disavowed Jewish ties to the Temple Mount. So I guess we shouldn't hold our breath, but is there any hope on the horizon here for it?
In terms of changing votes, there can be some hope because governments change. And, Canada is an example. About 20 years ago, the Canadian government was ruled by Jean Chrétien, and Canada at the time typically went along with Europe and voted for many of the anti-Israel resolutions and abstained on a handful. Under the leadership of first Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin, that began to change, and Canada became more supportive of Israel. And then under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, that accelerated quite rapidly. And by the end of Stephen Harper's tenure in 2015, Canada was voting no on basically every resolution, the way that the United States does. So that was a significant change. Here in Geneva, the government of Theresa May and Boris Johnson said if the Human Rights Council doesn't end its singling out of Israel through Agenda Item 7, they will vote no on every resolution. And they began to change their votes and began to vote no on resolutions brought under Item 7. All right, the Palestinians then did a trick, probably in cahoots with the British Foreign Office, where they began to move some resolutions to a generic agenda item. So the British only promised to vote no if it was under Agenda Item 7, but if it was moved to a generic agenda item, the same awful one-sided text, the British government could abstain or vote for it. So that's a caveat. But in my experience, countries can change their votes. Germany, Czech Republic recently changed their votes on one resolution. And these are all indications, you know, the PLO and Hamas, they look at the numbers. And if the numbers start to change, that's a way of feeling where things are going. It's a statement to the world on how much public support Israel has. And these things can change. And though the numbers are stacked against Israel, it's not a lost cause. And certainly, I'm sure someone's going to get to it eventually, but we see with the Abraham Accords that geopolitics can change. United Arab Emirates this morning tweeted, "We condemn the terrorist attack in Israel." Okay, and they went on. Human Rights Watch, the head of Human Rights Watch in New York, Ken Roth, made a tweet about this, sort of cold, kind of journalistic tweet about what happened, no condemnation. So the United Arab Emirates today is condemning a terrorist attack that Human Rights Watch won't condemn. And you saw, like everyone on this call saw a few days ago, you had Egypt, Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco. Am I missing one? I don't think so. And Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, were in Israel, which was a historic summit today. President Isaac Herzog was in Amman meeting the King of Jordan. So you have very significant geopolitical changes in the region. They haven't yet really reached the UN, but you know, the Arabs got their votes in large part because of oil. Who knows if Israel's gas reserves increase? Maybe some countries will begin voting for Israel because they want Israel's oil and gas, like they did it for the Arabs. Who knows? Right.
And have we seen any shift in votes from the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain?
No, it hasn't reached not really. Some minor exceptions. There was a vote last year where Bahrain absented itself. That seemed to be deliberate and kind of like an abstention, which would be a change from voting yes. But otherwise, the votes have been the same, and I wouldn't expect the votes to change, because if you were the Emirates, you could say, what do you want from us? We're embracing Israel bilaterally, but at the UN, all the countries, virtually all, even countries like Singapore that have had great relations with Israel for many years, they vote against Israel. That's the norm. You want us to be, we're an Arab Islamic country. You want us to be more pro-Israel than 90% of the countries with whom Israel even has, good relations. So it's the UN may be the last place that we'll see. It's all realpolitik and geopolitical other issues at play. Israel had, I remember maybe it was 2019, there was one sort of outlier, a special rapporteur, Ahmed Shahid, who is Muslim and from the Maldives. He released a report linking BDS to anti-Semitism and recognized the IRA working definition as something positive to fight anti-Semitism. How on earth was he able to release some positive report? And is there anybody else like him at the United Nations? Yeah, glad that you mentioned that. Ahmed Shahid was a UN expert. First, a word about him. He was the foreign minister of the Maldives when the Maldives became democratic. When they actually, it's an Islamic country, and they actually began to shift their position in a more favorable way towards Israel. He was foreign minister at the time, and then there was a coup d'etat, and he fled, and then he went to England. He's a professor there, and he was UN Special Rapporteur in Iran, where he did good things, and then he became Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion, where, as you indicated, he's issued some good reports on anti-Semitism. He's exceptional. I don't know enough about him personally. We've met a few times, but he's clearly an exceptional individual who's trying to do the right thing. And it's very courageous on his part. And I'm sure that he will be punished. His career will be punished as a result, and it's unlikely that he's going to get other UN positions that would be available if he did go against Israel.
Right. And then later this year, 2 UN bodies are going to join the apartheid call, right? So there's, I think we saw 68 senators, both Republicans and Democrats, sign onto a letter urging Secretary of State Blinken to sort of shut down this commission of inquiry. Can you just speak a little bit about these two different bodies? Like, what are this commission of inquiry? And I believe there's one on the elimination of racial discrimination, right? CRERD, that's also going to release a report on Israel later this year, correct?
I'll say a word on the racism committee and then the other one. So there are treaty bodies here in Geneva, which are bodies that enforce human rights treaties. And there's an anti-racism convention, which the founder of my organization, of our organization, of UN Watch, his name is Morris Abram. He passed away 20 years ago, was a great American civil rights leader, and he helped draft the UN Convention on the elimination of racial discrimination. So that's a good anti-racism treaty. There are 18 experts, independent experts, who enforce that treaty. And they've been asked by the Palestinians to sort of condemn Israel as a racist country, as kind of an apartheid country. So there's a formal mechanism that's quite rarely used, kind of one country suing another at the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, known as the CERD. So there is a kind of a lawsuit of Palestinians against Israel, like some kind of a dispute process taking place there. And it seems that the committee is not very favorable to Israel. There was a split decision on whether they had jurisdiction. The UN legal office in New York ruled that, well, gave an opinion that the CERD did not have jurisdiction because for various reasons, and but the experts ignored it, and the majority, not everyone, but there was a split, but the majority said they had jurisdiction, and that's probably the same majority that's going to rule against Israel. So that will be a ruling. It's not binding as far as I know, but it will not be a very nice thing if they declare Israel a racist country. Apart from that, there is a commission of inquiry that was created. That was created by the Human Rights Council. It's a lot of terminology for people, but in May there was a war last year between Hamas and Israel. Hamas fired 4,000 rockets at Israeli cities, and Israel fired back to stop the rockets, and was quite effective at doing so and at avoiding civilian casualties in a rather significant degree. Nevertheless, the Human Rights Council, as they always do, convened an urgent session, condemned Israel, and created a commission of inquiry targeting Israel, which has two elements. One is to investigate the war, where they're going to say Israel committed war crimes.
Right.
The second part is something very new. They're going to investigate, quote, systematic discrimination in Israel and the territories. What does that mean? Well, if you have any questions, just look at who they appointed. They appointed three people. The head of it, they appointed as Navi Pillay. Navi Pillay seems experienced. She was the head of the UN Human Rights Office. She was the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But in fact, Navi Pillay has a record of ardent anti-Israel advocacy. In fact, she lobbies against Israel. 2 years ago, she signed a manifesto which reads, quote, sanction apartheid Israel. She urged governments to sanction apartheid Israel. She calls to boycott Israel. She's the head. She's the impartial head of this inquiry. It's astonishing and it's insulting. We filed a motion saying that she must recuse herself because of her prior statements and because she's lobbying against Israel, and she's the judge. So they're going to report in June, and I think you can be quite certain that this commission of inquiry will conclude that Israel is an apartheid state, citing reports that have been published in the past year by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and as of Friday last, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Michael Link.
And so this commission of inquiry, though, it's ongoing, indefinite, unlimited funding. You know, this is like unprecedented in the United Nations, right? This is a brand new thing to have something like this.
It may be. There may be one other inquiry that has something like that. I'm not sure, but it's certainly exceptional. Most mandates last, you issue a report and the commission ends.
Right.
This one, as you indicated, goes on every year. They report in the Human Rights Council in June. They'll report in the General Assembly in September, and it's every year. It has millions of dollars. So it is certainly something quite extraordinary.
Right. Before we go to some audience questions, I just want to touch on one more thing, because the Human Rights Council isn't the only body. We have UNESCO, which adopts around 10 anti-Israel resolutions every year. We have the World Health Organization, which you would think should not have anything to do with Israel, but somehow singles out Israel from condemnation. We have the International Labor Organization, which is established to improve conditions of labor, and it has an annual conference which singles out Israel. So what are some of the things that they're singling out Israel for? And, what are these bodies? Just another entity, and why are they taking up Israel? All of these councils.
Before I answer, I just want to know, what is your time frame? How would you do your time?
Yeah, let's wrap it up. Maybe you'll take one audience question after this. So I guess brief. If you can go on for a couple more minutes, you don't have to run. Maybe we'll hit some of these.
Yeah, I'll say, I'm going to pause. Those are good questions you asked. The short answer is more or less the same kinds of things that are adopted. The World Health accuses Israel of violating Palestinian health. UNESCO accuses Israel of stealing Palestinian heritage sites like Jerusalem and Hebron, which they claim are Palestinian, and so forth. So,
okay. And let's just maybe ask you a couple real quick ones that you can hit on. One is, what can we do? Like, what can be done? What can people in the entertainment community do to help counter this stuff? Obviously, support organizations such as yourselves, but is there anything else that we could do?
Well, there's a lot that people can do. The first thing is to get informed, and you can do so in various ways. One, you're all invited to go on our website, unwatch.org, and to sign up to our newsletter. All the things that I described, we give regular updates once a week, twice a week. And you can follow us on social media. If you're on Facebook, you can follow UN Watch or Hillel Neuer, the same on Twitter, Instagram, and that's the best way to get informed. And the next thing is you can campaign on many of the things that I described. We have petitions, and they matter. If a congressperson gets hundreds and thousands of emails about a certain terrible thing happening at the UN, they will care. Same with a Secretary of State and others around the world. So it's actually very important. I'd say many of the people on this call, if they're not outraged and if they're not taking action, if they're not objecting to these things, nobody will. So if we want the Secretary of State to be doing something in America, or Foreign Minister of the UK or Canada, if people who care strongly about these issues are not speaking out, are not tweeting about it, and are not writing to their member of parliament, are not writing letters to the editor, are not writing op-eds, speaking out in all the ways that they can, then nobody else will. So I think that, as I said, I gave examples. Canada changed their votes. The UK changed their votes. On some things, Germany changed their votes. 38 countries, there was Durban 4, a commemoration of the Durban Conference was held in September, 20 years from Durban, and 38 countries pulled out. We never had that before. So that is a product of people, organizations speaking out and taking a stand. So I think, as I said, people need to be informed and then need to take action.
Okay, and then just one last.
Just to give an example, if I'll drop it into the Q&A here. We have a petition on Avi Pillay, and saying that she needs to step down as head of the Commission of Inquiry, and that's certainly something that people can sign. I'm just going to drop that into the chat box here.
Right, and someone said here it's unwatch.org, not .com. unwatch.org. One last question, and then we'll wrap it up, because I've seen this come up a bunch as well. Isn't it true that Israel is the only country that cannot sit on the UN Security Council? It never has. Is it true that it never can because it's not part of some sort of regional group?
That is a good question. It was once the case. Let me just drop in petition. So I dropped that into the chat to everyone. I'm just going to dropped in our website if people want to sign up, but that didn't really go. Okay. It is, I don't think it's true anymore. Israel was once not part of a regional group, but it now is, in New York, is effectively part of the Western group in New York. And so I think Israel can run for the Security Council, and actually is is trying to, I believe, in a number of years. Doesn't really have much of a chance. So, you know,
Do you think it could happen?
Technically, they can. Technically,
Okay.
they can. And I believe that they are, but I don't think they have much of a chance. If it's competition within the Western group, they won't get it. It would only work if other Western countries would agree to sort of step aside and allow Israel to have sort of a guaranteed seat from the Western group. But if other Western countries compete, whether it's Germany or others, then yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for this insightful conversation. Next week, we are joined by Yossi Klein-Levy to really dissect and do a deep dive into Zion and anti-Zionism. Make sure to sign up for that conversation, all our discussions. You can help donate. You can support our work at ccfpeace.com. That's ccfpeace.com. Before we go, Hillel, just one more time, where can people find you on social media? Because you're definitely a must follow on there.
Thank you. They can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at my name, Hillel Neuer, which is Neuer, or UN Watch as well. And our website is unwatch.org. I dropped it into the chat. People can see it there, and would love to see you guys on social media. And thank you for your support. And I want to thank your organization for the great work that you're doing.
Great. Thank you so much. We hope to see everyone in future events. Please stay safe. Thank you, Hillel. Take care.
Thank you.